My husband scoffed. Your opinion doesn't matter. Then he moved his parents into our home without my consent. I smiled. Fine. 2 days later, he stared at a legal document, his face turning white. Then he screamed, No, that's impossible. I never imagined my marriage would begin falling apart over a set of suitcases. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs had been there for years, scattered throughout ordinary moments like breadcrumbs I chose not to follow. At the time, though, life felt stable, predictable, safe. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I believed I was happily married. Ryan and I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver, Colorado. The Snorts houses weren't extravagant, but they were well kept with trimmed lawns, backyard grills, and neighbors who waved from across the street. It was the kind of place where people still borrowed ladders from each other and remembered your dog's name. I worked as a project manager for a software company. The job paid well, but it demanded long hours and careful attention to detail. Ryan worked in medical equipment sales. He was charming, outgoing, and naturally persuasive. Those traits had attracted me when we first met for a long time. They were also the reasons I excused his flaws. We had been married for 9 years. 9 years is a long time to build habits. Long enough to overlook things. Long enough to normalize behavior that would have shocked you at the beginning. When we first dated, Ryan used to ask for my opinion on everything. Restaurants, vacations, furniture, financial decisions. Over time, those conversations changed. Instead of asking, he started informing. Instead of discussing, he started deciding. At first, the changes were subtle. Then they became routine. By our 9th year of marriage, I often felt less like a partner and more like an employee receiving updates from management. The strange thing was that I didn't fully recognize it while it was happening. Most people don't. Control rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly wrapped in familiarity. One Saturday morning in early spring, I was drinking coffee on our back patio when Ryan walked outside carrying his phone. His expression already told me he wanted something. What is it? I asked. He sat down. My parents are having a rough time. I sighed internally. We had been having versions of this conversation for months. His parents, Frank and Linda, lived in Arizona. Frank had retired years earlier. Linda worked part-time at a gift shop. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling nearly as much as Ryan claimed. What happened now? I asked. Ryan rubbed his forehead dramatically. The rent went up again. I nodded. That's unfortunate. They can't keep doing this. I waited. There it was, the real conversation. What are you suggesting? Ryan leaned forward. I think they should move here. I nearly laughed because I assumed he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, I set my coffee cup down. Move here permanently. Yeah, Ryan, that's a huge decision. They're my parents. I know that. Then what's the problem? The problem wasn't his parents. The problem was that our house wasn't large enough for 4 adults to comfortably share forever. The problem was that Linda had a habit of criticizing every woman she met. The problem was that Frank treated every room like it belonged to him. The problem was that Ryan wasn't asking. He was selling. And whenever Ryan started selling, he had already made up his mind. I'd be willing to help them financially, I said carefully. His jaw tightened. They don't want charity. I'm not talking about charity. They need family. I looked at him. And what do we need? He didn't answer. That silence stayed with me. A week later, his parents visited. Officially, it was just a short trip. Unofficially, they spent the entire weekend evaluating the house. Linda opened cabinets. Frank inspected the garage. They discussed possible furniture arrangements as if they were reviewing real estate listings. By Sunday evening, my stomach felt heavy. After they left, I tried having another conversation. Did you notice your parents talking about the house like they already lived here? Ryan barely looked up from his phone. You're imagining things. No, I'm not. They were just making conversation. I knew better, but arguing felt pointless. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a Tuesday night. Nothing special. Chicken parmesan, garlic bread, a baseball game playing quietly on television. The kind of ordinary evening nobody remembers until something unforgettable happens. Ryan cleared his throat. My parents are moving in. I blinked. What? They'll be here Saturday? I stared at him. The words didn't fully register at first. What do you mean they'll be here Saturday? I mean they're moving in. I waited for the explanation. It never came. Instead, he continued eating. My heart started pounding. Ryan, we haven't agreed to this. He shrugged. We don't need to. The room suddenly felt smaller. What exactly does that mean? He finally looked up. His expression wasn't angry. That would have been easier. He looked amused, superior, like a man explaining something obvious to a child. Then he said the sentence, I will never forget. Your opinion doesn't matter. The words landed harder than a slap. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. 9 years. 9 years together. And somehow, our marriage had deteriorated into this moment. I looked at him across the table. He genuinely believed what he was saying. That was the worst part. There was no hesitation, no regret, no embarrassment, just certainty. I expected myself to yell. I expected tears. Instead, an odd calm settled over me, the kind that appears when something finally becomes impossible to deny. I smiled. Fine. Ryan looked surprised. Maybe he expected a fight. Maybe he wanted one. Instead, I stood up, carried my plate to the sink, and went upstairs. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was angry, because I was thinking, reviewing, connecting years of conversations, years of compromises, years of giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Around midnight, I got out of bed and walked into my home office. I opened a folder inside my filing cabinet. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years: property records, mortgage paperwork, legal records. I sat quietly under the desk lamp. Then I made a phone call. The next morning, during my lunch break, I met with a family attorney named Rebecca Lawson. She reviewed the documents carefully. After several minutes, she looked up. Mrs. Carter, just to confirm, I nodded. Rebecca adjusted her glasses. This house was purchased before your marriage. Yes, and only your name is on the deed. That's correct. She leaned back in her chair. A faint smile appeared. Then she asked the question that changed everything. So tell me, Emily, what exactly do you want to do next? Rebecca Lawson didn't rush me. That was the first thing I noticed about her. Most people hear a story, immediately form an opinion, and start offering advice. Rebecca simply listened. She sat across from me in her downtown Denver office, a legal pad resting on her desk while I explained 9 years of marriage in less than an hour. When I finally stopped talking, she folded her hands. Do you want to save the marriage? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unreasonable, because I realized I didn't know. A year earlier, I would have answered yes without hesitation. 6 months earlier, probably yes. That afternoon, though, I found myself staring out her office window at the traffic below. I don't know anymore. Rebecca nodded. Then don't make any emotional decisions today. I appreciated that answer. She wasn't pushing divorce. She wasn't pushing reconciliation. She was pushing clarity. Let's focus on facts, she said. The house is yours. Legally, that's straightforward. The bigger question is whether your husband's behavior is part of a pattern or a temporary lapse in judgment. I almost laughed. A temporary lapse. If only it were that simple. Over the next several days, I began paying closer attention than I had in years. What I discovered was painful, but it was also illuminating. Saturday arrived. So did Ryan's parents. A rental truck pulled into the driveway shortly after 9 in the morning. The amount of furniture immediately alarmed me. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't a trial period. This wasn't even a long-term stay. This was relocation. Ryan jumped out of the truck looking cheerful. Frank followed. Then Linda. By the time they started unloading dressers, side tables, and dozens of storage boxes, nobody was pretending anymore. Linda walked through the front door carrying 2 framed photographs. She glanced around the living room. "I think these will look lovely above the fireplace." "Not would these look lovely. Not what do you think?" A statement, an assumption, a declaration. I watched her hang one of the frames on the mantel. Ryan said nothing. Neither did Frank. Within 3 hours, the house no longer felt like mine. Frank took over the garage. Linda reorganized the kitchen. Ryan acted as if everything was perfectly normal. At dinner that evening, Linda criticized my cookware. The next morning, she criticized my grocery shopping. By Monday, she was criticizing the way I folded towels. Every comment was wrapped in a smile. Every insult disguised as advice. "Emily, sweetheart, that's not really how most wives do it." Or, "My generation took more pride in homemaking." Or, my personal favorite, "Ryan always deserved someone more traditional." Ryan never defended me. Not once. Instead, he chuckled. Sometimes he even agreed. I wish I could say I confronted them immediately. The truth is more complicated. Part of me still hoped things would improve. Part of me still believed Ryan would eventually recognize how inappropriate all of this was. Then Tuesday happened. I came home from work around 6:30. The moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was wrong. The living room looked different. Several decorations were missing. A bookshelf had been moved. A lamp I loved had disappeared. I found Linda in the dining room. "Where's my lamp?" I asked. "Oh, I put it in storage." I stared at her. "You what?" She smiled. "The room flows better this way." For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. "You put my furniture in storage." "Just a few things." I looked around. The dining room now resembled a showroom for Linda's personal taste. My furniture, my house, her decisions. I turned toward Ryan. He had just walked in from the garage. "Did you know about this?" He glanced around casually. "Looks nice." That was it. Looks nice. No discussion, no apology, no acknowledgement that someone had rearranged my home without permission. That night, I stopped hoping. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something inside me shifted. The illusion cracked. And once a person sees the truth clearly, it's difficult to unsee it. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared entirely by accident. Ryan had left his tablet charging on the kitchen counter. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching for evidence. In fact, I was loading the dishwasher when the screen lit up. A message notification appeared. Normally, I would have ignored it, but one line caught my attention. "Soon, we won't have to hide anymore." I froze. The message disappeared before I could read the rest. For nearly a minute, I stood there staring at the dark screen. My heart pounded. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe number. Deep down, I already knew. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was silent. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I kept replaying that message in my mind. Soon, we won't have to hide anymore. At 11:30, Ryan fell asleep. At midnight, I quietly walked downstairs. The tablet was still charging. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it. What I found changed everything. The messages stretched back nearly a year. Her name was Vanessa, 32 years old, marketing consultant, divorced, living across town. At first, the conversations were flirtatious, then intimate, then unmistakably romantic. There was no ambiguity, no room for denial. Ryan wasn't having an emotional affair. He was having a full relationship. My stomach twisted as I scrolled. Hotel reservations, photos, weekend trips disguised as work conferences, lies stacked on top of lies. But the worst message wasn't about love. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about me. One message from Vanessa read, "Are you sure she'll leave?" Ryan responded, "She always avoids conflict. Once my parents settle in, she'll get tired of it and move out herself." I stopped breathing. A clear throat. Second message appeared a few days later. Then we can finally start our life together, Ryan replied. Exactly. Just give it time. I felt cold. Not angry. Cold. Because suddenly everything made sense. The move, the pressure, the disrespect, the gradual erosion of boundaries. This wasn't carelessness. It was strategy. Then I found something even worse. A group text. Ryan, Frank, Linda. My pulse quickened. The conversation stretched back months. His parents knew. Not only knew, they supported it. Linda had actually written, "Once Emily leaves, Vanessa can move in and stop sneaking around." I stared at the screen over and over, reading the sentence repeatedly. 3 people, 3 adults planning the destruction of my marriage inside my own home. At 1:30 in the morning, I closed the tablet. Then I sat quietly in the dark. I expected tears. Instead, I felt calm. The calm that comes when uncertainty finally disappears. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was back in Rebecca Lawson's office. She listened carefully as I presented screenshots, messages, and emails. When I finished, she looked genuinely impressed. "You documented everything." I nodded. Rebecca smiled slightly. "Good." Then she opened a folder. Inside were documents she had already prepared. Divorce paperwork, property records, formal notices, everything organized with professional precision. She slid the folder across the desk. "The house remains your separate property." I looked down. My name appeared on every relevant document. "Only mine," Rebecca continued. "Emily, if you're ready, we can file immediately." For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, control. I picked up the pen and signed. The morning Ryan received the papers started like every other morning. That was the beautiful thing about consequences. They rarely announced themselves. They simply arrived. Wednesday began with coffee brewing in the kitchen, Frank watching cable news in the living room, and Linda criticizing someone on television before 8 o'clock in the morning. Ryan came downstairs wearing a blue dress shirt and checking emails on his phone. Nobody knew their lives were about to change, least of all Ryan. I stood at the kitchen counter stirring cream into my coffee, while Linda rearranged items inside a cabinet for what felt like the 100th time. "Emily," she said casually, "I've been thinking." I nearly laughed. That sentence had become a threat. "Oh, we should probably convert your office into a guest room." I looked up. "My office?" "Well, yes." She smiled as though discussing the weather. "Frank needs a quiet place for his hobbies." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Ryan nodded. "That makes sense." Of course it did. Everything made sense when it benefited them. I took a sip of coffee. "Interesting idea." Ryan barely glanced up. "We'll figure it out." "We..." The word irritated me more than it should have, because every decision lately seemed to involve a mysterious "we" that never actually included me. At 10:15, the doorbell rang. Frank answered it. A few moments later, he walked into the kitchen holding a large certified envelope. "Ryan," he said, "this is for you." Ryan looked mildly annoyed, probably expecting another insurance notice or work document. He signed the receipt, opened the envelope, then frowned. I watched his expression change. Confusion, curiosity, concern, then something else, something deeper. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages, back to the first page, then forward again. The color drained from his face. "What is this?" Nobody answered. Linda stood up. "What happened?" Ryan continued reading. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to become uncomfortable. Then suddenly he pushed back his chair hard. "What the hell is this?" Linda moved closer. Frank stood up. Ryan looked directly at me. For the first time in months, his confidence seemed shaken. "What did you do?" I set my coffee cup down carefully. "What does it say?" He stared at me, then at the documents, then back at me. His hands were trembling. The room felt completely silent. And then it happened. The moment from the beginning of this story. The moment that had lived in my imagination ever since I signed those papers. Ryan's voice cracked. No. He flipped through the documents. No. His breathing became uneven. Then he shouted. No, that's impossible. Linda grabbed the paperwork. What is it? Ryan looked genuinely panicked. Not angry. Panicked. The difference mattered because anger comes from believing you're still in control. Panic comes from realizing you're not. Linda scanned the first page. I watched her confidence evaporate almost instantly. Divorce. Her voice sounded small, confused. Then she turned another page and another until she reached the property documentation. What does this mean? Rebecca had prepared everything meticulously. The documents were clear, simple, undeniable. The house had been purchased years before my marriage. The deed listed only one owner, Emily Carter, me. There was no ambiguity, no loophole, no misunderstanding. Frank adjusted his glasses and took the papers. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Finally, Ryan looked up. This isn't right. It is. No. He shook his head. We're married. Yes, that means it's our house. I met his eyes. No, it doesn't. The silence afterward was deafening. Ryan looked stunned as though a law of physics had suddenly stopped working. But I've lived here for years. I know, but I paid bills. I know, but you assumed ownership. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out because there was no argument. Only assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. The kind people make when they mistake kindness for weakness. Linda recovered first. She always did. This is cruel. I almost admired the audacity. Cruel. After everything they had done. After months of manipulation. After helping Ryan plan a future with another woman. Cruel. I folded my arms. No. Cruel was moving into someone's home while planning to force them out. The room went silent again. Ryan's head snapped toward me. What are you talking about? For a brief second, I saw genuine fear. Not because he didn't understand, because he knew exactly what I meant. I walked to the counter, picked up my phone, opened a folder, then placed it in front of him. Screenshots, messages, emails, evidence, months of evidence. The blood drained from his face all over again. Linda looked over his shoulder, then immediately sat down. Frank stared at the floor. Nobody denied anything. Nobody could. The messages spoke for themselves. Ryan scrolled silently. The affair, the plans, the discussions, the assumptions that I would eventually leave. Every ugly detail documented, preserved, waiting. Finally, Ryan looked up. You went through my messages. The question was so absurd, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it revealed exactly where his mind was. Not on the affair, not on the betrayal, not on the conspiracy, on getting caught. Rebecca had warned me about that. Some people don't regret what they did. They regret losing the advantage. I looked at him calmly. You were planning a future with another woman. Ryan rubbed his face. It wasn't like that. A classic response. Predictable. Meaningless. I nodded toward the screenshots. It was exactly like that. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Ryan tried a different strategy, the apology, or at least the early version of one. Emily. His voice softened. We can work through this. I stared at him. The same man who had told me my opinion didn't matter. The same man who had moved his parents into my house without consent. The same man who spent months planning a life with someone else. Now he wanted teamwork. Interesting. What exactly are we working through? He looked desperate. A rough patch. A rough patch. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just honestly, because reducing betrayal, manipulation, and entitlement to a rough patch was almost impressive. Linda suddenly stood. Ryan made mistakes. I turned toward her, and you helped him. She froze. Frank remained silent. For the first time since moving in, he looked embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. The realization seemed to be settling over all of them simultaneously. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was reality, legal reality, financial reality, consequential reality, the kind nobody can argue with. At noon, my phone rang. "Rebecca," I answered on speaker. "Everything delivered successfully?" she asked. "Yes, good." Then her professional voice filled the room. She calmly explained the filing status, property rights, and next legal steps. Every sentence tightened the walls around Ryan's assumptions. Every fact removed another escape route. When the call ended, nobody spoke. The house felt different, lighter, somehow, as though a storm had finally broken. Ryan sat at the table, staring at the documents. The same documents that had shattered the future he thought he controlled. And for the first time since his parents arrived, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not yet, but the beginning of it. The strange thing about watching someone lose power is that it rarely happens all at once. In movies, everything collapses in a dramatic moment. In real life, people spend days trying to convince themselves nothing has changed. Ryan spent the next week doing exactly that. At first, he acted as though the divorce filing was some kind of misunderstanding, a paperwork error, a temporary emotional reaction, something that would eventually disappear if he ignored it long enough. By Thursday morning, he was already trying to negotiate. "Emily, can we talk?" I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing work reports before a virtual meeting. I looked up. "We are talking." He pulled out a chair. "I mean, seriously," I almost smiled. For months, he had dismissed my concerns, ignored my opinions, and treated my boundaries like inconveniences. Now suddenly, he wanted serious conversations. Funny how that works. "What do you want to say?" Ryan rubbed his hands together. "I made mistakes." There it was. Not a mistake. Mistakes. Plural. Yet, even then, he couldn't bring himself to name them. The affair, the manipulation, the disrespect. Those words never appeared. Instead, he spoke in vague language that kept responsibility safely out of reach. "We've both been under stress." I stared at him. "No, Ryan, you were having an affair." His face tightened. "That's not all this was about." I nodded. "You're right. It wasn't." He looked hopeful. Then I continued. "It was also about lying, disrespecting me, moving people into my home without permission, and trying to pressure me into leaving." The hope disappeared. Good. Hope built on denial isn't hope at all. It's avoidance. Across the room, Linda pretended not to listen while organizing kitchen drawers. Frank stared into a coffee mug. Neither of them interrupted. For once, Ryan exhaled heavily. "Can we at least try counseling?" The question might have moved me months earlier. Now it sounded like someone asking for a refund after breaking the product. "You should have suggested counseling before you started dating someone else." He looked away, conversation over. For the first time in years, I felt no need to rescue him from discomfort. That realization surprised me. Not because it was cruel, because it was healthy. For years, I had managed everyone's emotions, Ryan's frustrations, Linda's criticisms, Frank's moods. I had become the emotional shock absorber for an entire family. And now I was done. 3 days later, reality delivered another blow, one that had nothing to do with me. Vanessa left. I didn't learn about it intentionally. Ryan practically announced it. The argument started in the driveway. I was returning from the grocery store when I heard shouting. Ryan stood beside his truck phone pressed against his ear. His voice echoed through the neighborhood. "After everything, pause." "No, that's not fair." Another pause, then louder. "So that's it." I kept walking. Not my circus, not my monkeys. Still, his next sentence stopped me. "You knew I was getting divorced." A long silence followed. Then he lowered the phone. The call ended. He stood motionless for several seconds. Defeated. I didn't need details. I already understood. Vanessa had fallen in love with the version of Ryan that existed in his stories. The successful provider, the future homeowner, the man confidently building a new life, not the actual Ryan, the man facing divorce, legal expenses, and the loss of a house he never owned. Fantasy relationships often struggle when reality arrives. This one didn't survive the introduction. That evening, I overheard another argument. This one happened inside. Louder, misher, more revealing. Ryan and Linda were in the guest room. The walls weren't particularly thick. "Why would she leave now?" Ryan demanded. Linda sounded frustrated. "Maybe she wasn't who you thought she was." Ryan laughed bitterly. "Seriously?" Then came the sentence neither of them realized I could hear. "We did all this for nothing." Silence followed. A long silence. The words lingered. "We did all this for nothing. Not I. We." The alliance was finally cracking. Good. Because alliances built on selfishness rarely survive failure. The following week brought another development. Frank approached me alone. That had never happened before. He found me watering flowers near the front porch on a Saturday morning. The weather was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. For a moment, he simply stood there awkwardly. Then he cleared his throat. "Emily." I looked up. "Yes." He shifted his weight. The man suddenly looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. "I owe you an apology." I hadn't expected that. Not from Frank. Of the three of them, he had always been the quietest. The follower, the observer, the man who avoided conflict by letting others create it. I set the watering can down. "Okay." He looked embarrassed. "Ryan told us things." I waited. "He said you wanted out of the marriage." "Interesting." "He said you didn't care about the house." "More interesting." "He said eventually you'd leave anyway." I listened quietly. Frank sighed. "I should have asked questions." Yes, he should have. We both should have both. Meaning him and Linda. The admission mattered. Not because it erased anything. Because it acknowledged reality for perhaps the first time. "I was wrong," he said. Then he walked away. No excuses, no requests, no manipulation, just accountability. A rare thing, a valuable thing. Unfortunately, Linda wasn't ready for accountability. Not yet. 2 days later, she cornered me in the kitchen. Her tone carried the sharp edge I had come to know so well. "You've destroyed this family." I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because the accusation was absurd. "No, Linda." I looked directly at her. "Your son destroyed his marriage." She folded her arms. "You could have forgiven him." "Why?" The question surprised her. Clearly, she expected a defense, an explanation. Instead, I simply waited. Why? Why should I forgive betrayal immediately? Why should I absorb consequences that belong to someone else? Why was accountability always expected from the victim, but optional for everyone else? Linda couldn't answer because there wasn't an answer. Only entitlement. And entitlement sounds persuasive right up until someone asks it to explain itself. 3 weeks after the divorce filing, Ryan finally accepted the inevitable, not emotionally, legally. His attorney reviewed the property records. The conclusions were identical to Rebecca's. The house wasn't marital property. There would be no ownership claim, no dramatic courtroom reversal, no miracle, just facts. When Ryan received that confirmation, something changed. The anger disappeared. The bargaining disappeared. Even the denial disappeared. What remained was regret, raw, visible, and entirely too late. One evening, he found me sitting on the back patio watching the sunset. The Rockies glowed orange in the distance. The air smelled like freshly cut grass. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan sat down. "I really thought you'd stay." His voice sounded tired. I looked at him. "I know." He laughed softly without humor. "I thought you loved me too much to leave." There it was. The truth not hidden behind excuses, not wrapped in clever language, just truth. He had mistaken love for permission, patience for weakness, loyalty for surrender. And now he was finally beginning to understand the difference. Ryan's parents moved out first. The process was surprisingly quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no police officers standing in the driveway, just cardboard boxes, rental trucks, and the heavy silence that follows bad decisions. Frank found a small apartment across town. Linda followed, although she clearly wasn't happy about it. The morning they left, I watched from the kitchen window while movers loaded furniture into a truck. For a brief moment, I remembered the day they had arrived. The confidence, the assumptions, the certainty that they were stepping into a future they controlled. Now that certainty was gone. In its place stood reality. Frank carried boxes without complaint. Linda barely looked at the house. Part of me expected her to say something sharp before leaving. One final insult, one final attempt to blame someone else. Instead, she simply climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. The truck pulled away, and just like that, they were gone. The house immediately felt different. Not larger, lighter, as though someone had opened a window after keeping it shut for too long. I walked through every room that afternoon. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen. Each space felt familiar again. Peaceful, mine. I found the lamp Linda had placed in storage and returned it to its original spot. Then I moved my grandmother's framed photograph back above the fireplace. The small actions brought me more satisfaction than I expected. Not because they were acts of revenge, because they were acts of restoration. Over the next several weeks, Ryan continued preparing for his own move. The divorce process remained remarkably straightforward. There were no major disputes, no hidden assets, no legal theatrics. The facts were simply too clear. Eventually, even Ryan stopped fighting them. One evening, about a month before his departure date, he knocked on my office door. I was reviewing project schedules when he stepped inside. "Do you have a minute?" I looked up. "Sure." He sat down carefully as if entering a place where he no longer belonged. In many ways, he wasn't. For several seconds, he stared at the floor. Then he spoke. "Vanessa's getting married." That surprised me. Not because I cared, because it happened so quickly. "When?" "Next spring." I nodded. Ryan laughed quietly. The sound carried more sadness than bitterness. I guess she moved on pretty fast. I considered the statement, then answered honestly. "Maybe she was never where you thought she was." He looked up, our eyes met, and for the first time in a very long time, there was no defensiveness in his expression, only understanding. "You're probably right." The conversation ended there. Simple, uneventful, yet somehow meaningful. Because Ryan was finally beginning to see people as they were instead of as he wanted them to be. A month later, he moved out. I expected the day to feel triumphant. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. Closure rarely arrives with fireworks. More often, it arrives carrying a cardboard box. As the last truck disappeared down the street, I stood alone in the driveway. 9 years. 9 years reduced to paperwork. Moving trucks and memories. Some good, some painful. All finished. I won't pretend I felt nothing. Despite everything, Ryan had been part of my life for nearly a decade. I had loved him, truly loved him. The betrayal hurt precisely because the love had been real. But love alone isn't enough. Without respect, love eventually becomes exhaustion. Without trust, love eventually becomes fear. Without accountability, love eventually becomes permission for bad behavior. I finally understood that, and understanding brought peace. The following months became some of the healthiest of my adult life. I renovated the guest room and turned it into a reading space. I planted flowers in the backyard. I joined a local volunteer organization that helped women navigate financial and legal challenges after divorce. That experience changed me more than I expected. Every week I met people carrying stories remarkably similar to mine. Different names, different cities, different circumstances. Yet the same core lesson appeared again and again. Too many good people mistake endurance for strength. Too many kind people tolerate behavior they should never accept. Too many loyal people believe setting boundaries makes them selfish. It doesn't. Sometimes boundaries are the most loving thing a person can create for themselves and for others. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected text. "Ryan, would you be willing to meet for coffee?" I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I agreed. Not because I wanted reconciliation, because I felt ready. We met at a small coffee shop downtown on a chilly October afternoon. Ryan looked different. Not physically, emotionally. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. Life had sanded down some sharp edges. After a few minutes of small talk, he set down his coffee cup. "I owe you an apology." I waited. A real apology sounds different from a strategic one. You can hear the difference almost immediately. Ryan took a breath. "I spent years taking you for granted." I remained silent. I convinced myself that because you were patient, you'd always stay. Another pause. "I treated your kindness like weakness." There it was, the truth. Not polished, not rehearsed, just truth. His eyes drifted toward the window. "I kept waiting for someone else to make me happy." He shook his head, and I nearly destroyed everything because of it. For the first time since our separation, I believed him. Not because he wanted something, because he didn't. There was no request, no manipulation, no hidden agenda, only accountability. The kind that arrives after consequences have already done their work. When he finished speaking, I smiled gently. "I forgive you." His eyes widened slightly. Then I added the part that mattered most. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know, and I think he truly did." We talked for another 20 minutes before saying goodbye. When I walked back to my car, I felt surprisingly light. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't something you give another person. It's something you give yourself. It allows you to stop carrying weight that no longer belongs to you. That evening, I sat on my back porch as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The air was cool. The neighborhood was quiet. A soft breeze moved through the trees. The house stood exactly where it always had. But I wasn't the same woman who had once sat here wondering whether her voice mattered. I knew better now. The greatest revenge wasn't taking everything from Ryan. The greatest revenge was refusing to let him take anything else from me. Not my home, not my dignity, not my future, and certainly not my sense of self-worth. If there's one lesson this experience taught me, it's this. When someone tells you your opinion doesn't matter, believe what they're revealing about themselves, not about you. The people who truly love you value your voice. They respect your boundaries. They don't mistake your kindness for permission to hurt you. And if they do, eventually life has a way of teaching lessons that no argument ever could. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive through anger. Sometimes it arrives through truth. And truth is powerful enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment when someone underestimated you only to learn they were wrong? Share your experience in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, accountability, and overcoming betrayal, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next.